It's the amazing Rico Brogna podcast with your host, Evan Roberts.
Rico! Brogna! I'm going to start timing myself to see how far or how long I could go with the now traditional Rico Brogna entrance or beginning to our podcast. But thank you very much for listening, downloading, and subscribing to another edition of Rico Brogna. One thing we will focus on today are the high-priced, high-tag marquee free agents. And to me, there are two of them. There's really one of them. Like, there's the league, there's the class of elite times 10, the generational talent, if you will, the Alex Rodriguez free agent of our era, and that is obviously Juan Soto, a guy that's gotten a lot of attention over the last 8-9 months since the Yankees traded for him, and we as Met fans have been kind of fantasizing about him. The other big ticket free agent, and it is more complicated, I admit, there's more nuance to it, is Corbin Burnes. In my opinion, no offense to Max Fried, no offense to Blake Snell, the other starting pitchers at the top of the market, Corbin Burnes is the top-level starting pitcher on the market. And obviously the Mets, David Stearns has a connection with Corbin Burnes considering the history in Milwaukee. So today we'll focus on both of those free agents. We'll do a deep dive on A, if they're worth signing, B, how far you should go to get them, and then C, and I think this may be the most important question when you target a free agent from another team, and that's projecting what they're going to be over the life of that contract, which is not easy to do. And, I've always said this. I know some may disagree. When you're re-signing somebody, when we're doing a podcast about Pete Alonso or a few years ago on Jacob deGrom, to me, missing on what those guys do over the course of the contract hurts just a little bit less because you got performance from them prior to the new contract. Now, I know some people will just say, well, why does that matter? If I gave a guy an 8-year, $300 million deal and he sucked in those 8 years, don't tell me about the first 5. They don't matter. I think for me, and I think for some of us, there is that sentimentality where sometimes when you buy a free agent, you're paying for what they did. Paying for what a player did in a different market doesn't make you feel very good. Paying for what a guy did for you makes it a little bit easier. So when it comes to Soto and Burnes, you're literally paying for the life of that contract. Let's start off with Juan Soto, who is a guy that we've talked about now probably for multiple years, even before the Nationals traded him to the San Diego Padres. When a couple of years ago came and the Nationals were clearly going to move on from him, I think the tone around trading for Juan Soto was very different. It was, hey, this would be worth it. You get the guy for a couple of years, and then you worry about free agency when it comes. I think the problem the Mets ran into when Juan Soto became available was that the Washington Nationals were never going to trade him to the New York Mets. It was never a thing. Mike Rizzo was never. Even if the Mets matched up with prospects, and they didn't, especially considering what they ended up getting from San Diego and how the Nationals basically rebuilt their team, there was never, A, a package that was going to line up, and B, Mike Rizzo was never dealing him to the New York Mets. So opportunity number one to acquire Juan Soto at the age of 23 years old, as disgusting as it was, in the middle of a pennant race. Because remember, this was 2022. This was when the Mets were good. And instead, they're ended up with, Daniel Vogelback of the world. So it was definitely a very different time when you think about where the Mets were, but also what they were in position to give up and if the Nationals were ever seriously going to make that trade, which I don't think they ever were going to do. Now, last year, and we talked about this on the Rico, and we may have had some debates about this, I never thought it made sense for the Mets to trade for Juan Soto. And honestly, I think I've been proven correct in a way. Now, in one breath, the Mets had a far better year than we have expected. And if they do trade for Juan Soto, do they have a better chance to win a world championship last year? Absolutely. I don't think any of us saw that coming. I don't think any of us thought that acquiring Juan Soto would change everything and make the Mets a championship team. I also didn't think they had the right package to match up with San Diego. The Padres clearly wanted major league ready pitching, which the Yankees were able to supply. But the other reason, and this is why I do think I was proven a little bit right on not trading for Juan Soto, is that I never thought trading for him was going to give you a leg up. And that's the fallacy that some Yankee fans repeated to us. And I believe it is a fallacy. The idea of, but when we get him here and we show him New York City and we have success, which ultimately the Yankees did, they got to the World Series, how could he leave? How could he possibly leave? Well, it's easy. He'll leave because he's going to go to the highest bidder. And as we sit here today on this Rico Brogna, early November, he's going to the highest bidder. I think most people have come to accept that. So as the Mets enter this free agency, I don't think acquiring him and having him here for a year would have really served as much of an advantage at all. It comes down to paying him. Now let's look at Juan Soto, the baseball player. A couple of years ago, when we had a discussion about Aaron Judge, Shohei Ohtani, and Juan Soto, one of the concerns I had about Juan was that if you looked at his career numbers, they started to dip a little bit. He was still great. He was still getting on base at a high clip. He was still a really productive player, but he wasn't necessarily the guy he was in 2019, in 2020, and even 2021. And look at the numbers. In 2022, before the Nationals traded him away, he was hitting 246 with an 895 OPS. Fine numbers, by the way. 21 home runs, 46 RBIs in 100 games. Like, not bad numbers, but they were down. He then gets traded to the San Diego Padres, and I thought this was a huge warning sign. Luckily, I've recovered from this, which we'll get to. He goes to the San Diego Padres, plays 52 games. It's 236 with a 778 OPS. Not even close. The worst kind of run in his major league career. And so what I found peculiar about Juan when we talked about this a year and a half ago was even though he was so young and was only 24 years old, you were starting to see a dip in his production. And it made you wonder, like, why is a guy at age 23 years old in the probably before the prime of his career dipping in production? Why across the board are his numbers down? Why is his batting average way down? His on base was good, still very good, but also down. Why? And that definitely, to me, put up a flag or two saying, what's happening here? But to Juan Soto's credit, in 2023 with the San Diego Padres, he had a bounce-back season where his production didn't quite get to 21, 20, and 19, but was back up on that MVP level. He had 275, just a shade below his career batting average, had his OPS above 900, hit 35 home runs, which is the most home runs in his career, and walked 132 times. He was back. And so when the Padres decided to trade him, I was kind of back feeling, all right, that little slide that we were noticing has gone away. Because remember, Ohtani was doing the opposite. Ohtani was like, I'm putting my hand up in the air like it's a car going into the sky or a plane flying into the sky. But that's what was happening. What Juan Soto did with the New York Yankees in his 1 year there, hopefully his 1 year there, in New York City with a crap ton of pressure, has eased any concerns I had, and maybe you had, about some kind of weird decline early in Juan Soto's career. Because remember this, when Juan Soto was traded to the San Diego Padres, he did not produce. In fact, he produced at such a low level, and I remember giving you these stats on the Rico that Pete Hoffman then repeated to Tiki Barber and BT on the air, and they killed him for it. And I was like, Pete, you got to be careful with certain information. You got to present it the right way. But Tiki tells me about that. He remembers Pete bringing this up. But it was the numbers that since Soto was traded to San Diego and since the Mets acquired Daniel Vogelbach, a lot of their numbers were very similar. Now, you hear that and you say, what are you suggesting? Are you suggesting that Juan Soto's Daniel Vogelbach? No. What I was suggesting, is that over a smallish sample size, Juan Soto was not even close to being the productive player he was. So it led to, did he have a tough time adjusting to a new team? Did he have a tough time adjusting to being traded in the middle of the season? Was the pressure getting to him? You know, guys are human beings. Not everyone has monster years as the pressure starts to build on their contract status. Remember, Juan Soto turned down a monster offer from the Washington Nationals. Now he gets traded to a brand new team. There's huge expectations. The Padres gave up basically their entire system. And Juan Soto's out there hitting 236 with a 778 OPS, basically putting up Volbackian kind of numbers. Volbackian. But Juan Soto answered those calls. Like I said, he had a huge year in 2023. And then when he gets traded to the New York Yankees, Juan Soto put up probably the best full season numbers of his major league career. 2020, he was a monster, had an OPS that I don't think he'll ever match again, had a batting average that he'll ever match again, but it was also in 50 games. So I don't know how you judge it. But Juan Soto this year with the New York Yankees, despite, and including his exploits in the postseason, hitting a home run to win the American League Championship, all the great at-bats that he had during that postseason, hit 288, which is the third highest batting average of his major league career. He had a 989 OPS outside of 2020, the second highest OPS of his major league career. He walked 129 times, 10 more times than he struck out. He had a career high 41 home runs and drove in 109 runs and had the highest WAR of his major league career at a 7.9. He gave you the best year of his major league career with the most pressure in New York City, which is always that test when you're talking about a big-time free agent. Can he play in New York City? Juan Soto answered that. I believe this past season with the New York Yankees, and if the Mets end up signing him, this will be fun to kind of think about in the history books, turned out to be the greatest test run in the history of New York Mets history. You allowed him to go to New York City, prove he can play probably with even more pressure than he'll have with the Mets. There's a different kind of pressure with the Mets that we would get into. He goes to New York City. He's in a contract year, and he produces the most he's ever produced. And then in the postseason was incredibly reliable, including hitting a home run that sent the Yankees to the World Series. So offensively, between having one of the great eyes you'll ever see this side of Barry Bonds and Tony Gwynn, giving you that power where he didn't fall in love with the short porch at Yankee Stadium. He may have taken advantage of it a little bit, but he clearly did not change his approach. Handling the pressures of New York City. To me, Juan Soto answered every question this year, and he is who we thought he was. If there was any hesitation about his struggles after the trade to San Diego, if there were any hesitations about the dip in production that occurred between 2021 and 2022 and 2023, in my opinion, he answered those questions. Juan Soto is a career 285 hitter. His average season is 35 and 100. His OPS is 950. Look, I'm not going to tell you he's Barry Bonds. He's not. I don't think anybody we will ever see again is Barry Bonds. But his at-bats are wars. His production is incredible. He's a clutch player. He changes a lineup. He changes a team. Now, there are other aspects of Juan Soto that, honestly, I don't even want to waste my time on the Rico in terms of ticket sales and what it does to the Met brand and how you, the Rico listener, can rub it into your Yankee fan friends. Those are all, to me, side benefits. I'm not saying I don't care about them. I just don't care about them nearly as much as the production of a great player, as the production of a player that changes your franchise for the next decade. Juan Soto hits lefties as well as he hits righties. Juan Soto has put up great production in basically every ballpark he's ever played in. Juan Soto is a clutch player. Juan Soto at Citi Field, this is my favorite part, because if this comes to fruition, getting to see Juan Soto all the time at Citi Field and see if he could match these numbers would be one of my most favorite things to do. Juan Soto has played 35 games at Citi Field. He is a .327 career hitter with a 1,175 OPS with 12 home runs. Now, you could say a part of that is Juan Soto just destroyed crappy Met pitching over the years in his time in Washington. Sure, maybe. That could be a factor. Or maybe Juan Soto, who hits the ball to left center field better than anybody in baseball, has taken advantage of the fact, and we don't think about this very often, that the dimensions at Citi Field are actually beneficial to a hitter like Juan Soto that goes to left center field. So offensively, there are no issues. He's a generational offensive player. But the key thing I said was offensive player. Let's get to his defense, because his defense can't be ignored. I was looking at a lot of the defensive metrics around Juan Soto. Obviously spent a lot of time in left field. This past year was playing right field for the New York Yankees. And one thing I've learned about defensive metrics is that they're good to look at, especially for players that you don't get to see every single day. But if you get to see a guy play every single day, I throw the defensive metrics out because I think you can trust your eyes. You can trust what you see. One thing that frustrates me about some of the defensive metrics, and outs above average is probably the one that, if I'm picking one that I trust more than others. I probably trust that one more than others. But I don't like how they're all over the place. I don't like how Francisco Lindor can be graded elite on one stat and below average on another. And anybody who watches Lindor knows how good he is. So with Soto, we have an unfair advantage. At least I do. I don't know how many people sit there and watch every Yankee game. It's certainly not your job to. It's part of my job to. So I would argue, I can't say I saw every single inning Juan Soto played in right field, but I saw a vast majority of it. And the way I would define Juan Soto's defense is that he's average. Like, he made plays this past year. We all remember opening day, the outfield assist that helped the Yankees win a game. Like, he'll make a play here and there. His range in right field is not very good. I wouldn't say he's a butcher. I wouldn't say he's unplayable. I wouldn't declare at age 26, boy, that guy has to DH. I don't think that's true. But I'm also not going to lie to you and tell you he's Roberto Clemente, because he's not. That's not true. But I think watching him every day with the Yankees gave me kind of the comfort that he's okay defensively. He's okay. I don't even think he's bad enough where I'm taking him out late in games. I also think he's so good offensively, I wouldn't want to take him out late in games. But one of the things that we now have, as much as I bitched about it for many years, we have the designated hitter. And the DH spot is a spot that can be used to your advantage. It's why ideally you don't want your DH spot kind of clogged by a guy who can only DH. Now, certain circumstances will lead you there. Maybe there's a guy on your roster that you have to a long-term contract, and just eventually they become a DH, and you really don't have another option. JD Martinez this past year clogged DH, but I think we were okay with it. It was a one-year deal. You know, it didn't feel like there were that many better options, and the Mets are going to move on from JD Martinez, and I think we all agree. But the DH spot needs to be used as a weapon. It needs to be used where if you're giving Juan the kind of long-term contract he's going to need, yeah, when he's 38 years old, he should probably DH. I mean, that's okay to think that way. If there was no DH in the National League, I think this conversation is a little bit more complicated. I admit that. Because you know you don't have that comfort of saying, all right, he's just a DH. And let's not be fooled by this. If you sign Juan Soto to the contract he's going to look for, and we'll get into the numbers in a second, he's going to be a DH at the end of his career. But I'd take it a step further. Juan Soto plays all the time. It's one of his great attributes. And that should not be forgotten when we talk about him as an offensive player, as a defensive player. The guy plays. The term now used in 2024 is he posts. I don't know when that became a popular term, but that's now like the thing. He posts. He posts. Isn't that like a horse reference, by the way? Either way, I'll use regular English for you. Juan Soto plays all the time. That's a very positive attribute. What I would do if I'm lucky enough to sign him is I would take maybe the number's 20, maybe that's the number, 15, and say you're going to DH those games. Not only to get you off your feet, because I'm not just thinking about this year, I'm thinking about the whole shebang, but I want to keep you healthy in the short term. I want to keep you healthy in the long term. I also want that better defense in right field every once in a while. And depending on the makeup of the Met outfield, they may be in position to do that. So my overall point to you is, yes, he's average as a base runner. Yes, he's average and will eventually become below average defensively. I think he's such a good hitter that those other things are not affecting me on how much money I'm going to give him. It's nice to be a great all-around player. It's nice. It'd be fantastic if he was a Gold Glove defensive right fielder. But it doesn't make or break my view on him. It also doesn't make or break my view on him moving forward. Because, yeah, we have to expect that as a defensive player, if he's average right now, if you agree with me that he's an average defensive player, it's probably only going to get worse. But I also think offensively, this guy has, at age 26, 10 more years. I'm not exaggerating. I really think this. 10 more years as either an elite level offensive player or just a really good offensive player. Why, you ask? Because of that eye. Because even when Soto slumps, he'll get on base. I am not concerned about what Juan Soto is at 34 years old. And that, by the way, is like 9 years into the contract. I'm not. So ultimately, it leads to this question, and we'll get to Corbin Burnes in a few minutes. How far are you willing to go contract-wise? Before I give you my answer, I posed the question on social media this morning. Very simply, if you're the Mets, what's the highest offer you'd make to Juan Soto and Corbin Burns? Let's start with Juan Soto. Let's start with Joe DeMayo, who does a great job. He has a Mets podcast himself, which you should absolutely check out. Does a great job with the Met farm system. Joe DeMayo, I think, was the first person to respond to this. And his answer with Juan Soto was, the limit within the realm of reality doesn't exist. And that opinion that Joe DeMayo has is a very popular opinion. Joey Sanchez writes, Juan Soto, there isn't a big enough number I'd go over $1 billion. Tim Jones writes, Soto, the sky is the limit, whatever it takes. Jay Money writes, Soto, whatever it takes. CJM writes, for Soto, I do whatever it takes to get the job done. They have to sign him. So that's a very popular opinion. Now, there are some numbers mixed in there. Ethan writes, 14 years, $700 million would be the limit. Now, my only pushback to that would be, and that's a very reasonable number that he may end up with. I think 700 is kind of that magic number, and that's $50 million a year. So I think you hit the two magic numbers that Scott Boras is going to try to get, $50 million a year, which I do not think is unreasonable when you look at salaries around baseball. You know, Aaron Judge is making 43. Max Scherzer, Verlander made 43. Mike Trout's in the low 40s. Like, okay, for him at 26 years old, prime of his career, to have that number jump up to 50, I don't think is crazy. And when you're 26 years old and you sign a 14-year contract, that takes you till you're 39. Not that crazy. It really isn't. But my pushback to 14 years, $700 million would be, what if you hear the Yankees offer 14, 720? You're not going to outbid them? And that's where things get dicey. And that's where the opinion of there's no limit kind of comes in. I think I lean towards that, where this is the player where if you're willing to go to the $50 million a year territory, the $700 million overall, why would you stop there? Nick Stasiak has the exact same number. 14 years, $700 million. Mac LGM writes, Juan Soto, I'd go to $48 million per year for 14 years. So I'm at 14,672. We're all kind of in the same range on that. Pete Bellotti, who we work with at WFAN, he's also at the Odyssey Sports Network, says 13 years, $650 million, but he's got a creative idea. Give him $65 million each of the first 4 years and then save it on the back end. So actually go the opposite of what teams are doing where they defer. You just pay him immediately. So I understand the logic on that. The logic is, hey, pay him more money when you're more confident he's going to be a great player. But ultimately, it really doesn't do you any good because the AAV still gets averaged out. So it doesn't really change that, if my understanding is correct. And then B, it's like us. You know, I know Steve Cohen isn't us, but do you want to pay all that money for the furniture now, or do you want to wait on it? Collect interest on that money and then pay it. So I get the thinking, but it actually doesn't really benefit you as much as you think. Here's the guy that topped it. You know, we have people saying there's no limit. Eli Yang writes, $800 million. Sexy Dexy Enjoyer writes, I don't care whatever it takes. Eric South, 12 years, $700 million. Big Pimpin', 14 years, $680 million. Jeremy's got a very creative idea. 1 year contract, $100 million. By the way, that may be the 1 year deal that Scott and Juan would take, because if you're that confident in yourself and you're only 26 years old, bang $100 million and then go back into free agency a year later. Bleeding Me is the one person that's kind of, it sounds like against signing Juan Soto. Keep building the team the way we've been building it. So I want to respond to that because I also got a few emails about this saying, hey, forget Juan Soto. You have Drew Gilbert. You have Jet Williams. You have these young outfielders. Why do you feel the need to buy Juan Soto for $700 million? Keep this in mind about signing Juan Soto. You're not giving up Drew Gilbert. You're not. Now, we're talking about a separate trade. If we're talking about a deal that someone just came up with, okay, fine, but we're not. We're talking about literally adding a great player. in which, yes, you'll lose a draft pick, but you're not losing Drew Gilbert, nor are you blocking him. If the New York Mets sign Juan Soto for the numbers that you heard some Met fans suggest, or for whatever it is, Drew Gilbert is going to have a chance to play this season. Because I would think that even though we kind of envision Steve Cohen having this bottomless pit of money, I'm pretty confident that Pete Alonso's gone. And I know that's an emotional thing for a lot of us. And ideally, you'd keep Pete Alonso. But you'd also understand if they're paying $50 million a year to a generational talent like Juan Soto, they're going to cut corners in other places offensively, especially because they do need to build a rotation. So Brandon Nimmo probably stays in left. And all of a sudden, if Starling Marte is the DH, or maybe you dump Starling Marte, but probably just your DH, center field's wide open. So I reject the notion that signing Soto would have any negative impact on your young players. There will be opportunities for them to play. If they can perform, if they can earn their way up here, and I mentioned this on the last Rico, I'll mention it here as we talk about Juan. If I sign Juan Soto, I would absolutely make sure there's still an avenue for Drew Gilbert to earn an everyday major league job at some point in 2025. So ultimately, the figures that I kind of laid out for Soto are very similar to a lot of our suggestions. It's 15 years, $725 million. It is $50 million a year, which I think is what Boris is going for, and it's getting to that $700 million number. It's also getting to 15 years. I also believe, and this is where maybe some will differ on me, if you can get 8 or 9 monster Hall of Fame seasons out of Juan Soto, that's a little bit more than half of the life of the contract. Obviously, you want to win a championship. I don't think a championship is, though, fully dependent on the production of Juan Soto. You need a lot of other things to help you win a World Series, which we all know. That, to me, makes the contract worth it. And I know that sounds crazy because it's like, wait a second. So you're willing to have the last 5 years be crappy or mediocre? Yeah. I think you have to know that going into a monster contract. If your bar for Soto's contract being successful, if your bar is all 15 years have to be great or 12 out of the 15 have to be great, then I hate to tell you this, it's very unlikely to be successful if that's your bar. But with a lot of these free agent signings, I look at it as if you can get me more than half of it being really successful, like on a Hall of Fame level, then it would be worth it. Eyes wide open. Back end of that contract can get ugly. But sometimes you got to do what it takes to get the baseball player. And very few free agents will ever come along that match the age, match the ability, match the resume of Juan Soto. And for some Met fans, like I pointed out, they will enjoy dunking on Yankee fans. Fine. I probably will a little bit too. But the end-all, be-all to me is not dunking on Yankee fans. It's not even selling out Citi Field, which I know Steve Cohen will and should care about. It's getting the great player. I said this on the air the other day. I still regret the Mets failing to get A-Rod. I think it was a missed opportunity. And I think the history of this franchise would have been completely different if they got the generational talent when he was available during the offseason of 2000. And I think the Mets had a few mistakes that they made. One, they had the wrong ownership. They did. Steve Cohen, I think, is the right owner, the right guy who's at least willing to kind of dive into that pool of big money. But I also think the Mets made a mistake that David Stearns cannot make this offseason. The Mets made the mistake of believing that because they won the pennant, they didn't need A-Rod. They made the mistake of, well, we won the National League. Like, how far do we really have to go? When the reality is, the Mets won the pennant. They had 2 successful years in a row, but they were not better than the Braves. They weren't. And you also have to look at that roster and say, all right, is Robin Ventura going to do that again? Is Todd Zeile going to remain productive? Is Mike Piazza going to remain that productive? Is Edgardo Alfonso going to remain that productive? Is Al Leiter going to? These were all veteran guys. And the biggest mistake the Mets made, I believe this at the time, is they believed they were better than what they were. So it wasn't just Fred Wilpon maybe cheapening out on giving A-Rod 252 or the 24-1 fallacy that was created. It was they believed they were better. Now, the Mets had a great year. They got to the 6th game of the NLCS. I don't know if I should say great year. They had a very successful season. Do not believe you're that good. You can't do that. And I don't think David Stearns does. I'm not worried about that. I guess my only worry is we've envisioned Steve Cohen as this monster owner that will stop at no cost to get what he wants. Prove it. I'm sick of saying it. I'm sick of dreaming about it. You're sick of dreaming about it. While he is a big market owner, there's no denying that. Trading for Lindor, signing him, the contracts to Scherzer, the contract to Verlander, eating those contracts. He is absolutely a big market owner and a far more aggressive spending owner than Fred Wilpon and Jeff Wilpon. But if you are who we thought you were, those first few tweets I read, they're the right answer. Don't get outbid. If it gets to an uncomfortable territory, get uncomfortable. If it gets to a territory where you're like, oh, I was willing to go to 680, but 725, go there. So I am all in on signing Juan Soto, and I also understand the repercussions of that. I understand that the likelihood of Pete Alonso coming back, dim if they sign Juan Soto. Could they still bring Pete Alonso back? Sure. But I also understand financially that will be very difficult. Let's get to Corbin Burnes because I find Corbin Burnes to be fascinating. So, little deep dive on Corbin Burnes, who is, to me, the best pitcher available. He is a guy that's had great success at this level. He's won a Cy Young. He got traded with a lot of hype to the Baltimore Orioles and overall had a very successful season. Made his one postseason start, was very good in the postseason. He is 30 years old. So he's 30. He will turn 31 late October. So this is his age 30 season. So you give him a 5-year deal, you're talking about 30, 31, 32, 33, 34. Before we get started on Corbin Burnes, I pulled up StatHead on Baseball Reference, which is kind of cool sometimes. And what I love about StatHead is when you can compare two players. You can put two players side by side. So I decided to do that with Corbin Burnes through his major league career as he enters free agency. And I put right next to him Garrett Cole. And the reason I put Garrett Cole right there is because Garrett Cole is, to me, up until this season, obviously, at his injuries, the most reliable starting pitcher in all of Major League Baseball, and a guy that I think is the contract you're gunning for if you're Scott Boras. Garrett Cole ended up getting a 9-year, $324 million contract. Garrett Cole, upon getting to free agency, was 29 years old. So age-wise, he was a year younger than what Corbin Burnes is right now. He went into that season at age 29. Corbin Burnes is going into this season at the age of 30. Okay? So just a couple of things to keep in mind when comparing these players and looking at these players. The other thing is, well, which one was better? Forget about what Garrett Cole did with the Yankees. Let's look at what he was doing upon getting to free agency. Like, where was he? So again, the age, the difference in age. There's a 1-year age difference. Here are the numbers. Corbin Burnes, so far, major league career as he enters free agency, made 199 starts. Garrett Cole was at 192. So very similar. Just a 7-start difference. I apologize. Let me fix that. Games started was 192 for Garrett Cole, 138 for Corbin Burnes. I was including Corbin Burnes as relief appearances early in his career. To me, I wiped that out because that's not starting games at a high level. So there is a pretty big difference. I'd say about a 1.5 year difference in terms of starts. Garrett Cole had much more experience as a dominant starting pitcher, and he was a year younger. So keep that in mind. Innings pitch shows you that story. Garrett Cole in his major league career had thrown 1,195 innings. Corbin Burnes is at 903. So you're talking about a good 1.5 year difference in terms of innings. Now, the positive for Burnes on that is he's got less wear and tear. I almost look at the fewer innings as a positive. That's one of the cases I used to make about Jacob deGrom. So innings-wise, Garrett Cole's about a 1.5 year more of experience than Corbin Burnes, despite being a year under him. ERA, Garrett Cole, 3.22. By the way, his ERA with the Yankees since signing, 3.12. So a little bit better. 3.22 with Pittsburgh and Houston. Corbin Burnes, 3.19. Very, very similar. ERA plus. Garrett Cole 127, Corbin Burns 129. Strikeout percentage, because I think we have to look at that since the innings are so different. Corbin Burns, whose strikeout percentage is going down, we'll address that in a few minutes, was at 28.8%. Garrett Cole, 27.6%. Garrett Cole walked about 60 more guys, but you also have to factor in the innings. So let's go to walk percentage. Garrett Cole ahead of him, 6.5%. Corbin Burns, 7%. So here's what those numbers tell me, and this is kind of worrisome, by the way. They're very similar. Like, they really are. There's a 1-year age difference, which may factor in terms of years. Sure, Garrett Cole got 9 years. Their innings, I think, kind of help Burns a little bit, only because he's thrown less. But nevertheless, the ERA is basically the same. The ERA plus is basically the same. The strikeout percentage, slight advantage Burns. The walk percentage, slight advantage Garrett Cole. Burns has won a Cy Young. Garrett Cole had not won a Cy Young. All-Stars, I don't think anybody cares about, but I'll give it to you anyway. 4 for Burns, 3 for Garrett Cole. Both won an ERA title. Their numbers are very, very similar. There is a big difference, though. Okay? Because this kind of report that I laid out to you is probably something that Scott Boras would lay out. Because he would say, hey, look at these numbers. They're pretty much the same. Let's start with 9 years, 324, which gets Burns to $36 million a year. So even if you say, I want to give Corbin Burns less years, but the money has to be the same, you're looking at 7 years, 250, which is what I think Boras is trying to get, and ultimately what he may get. But here's a big difference where Corbin Burns is not Garrett Cole. When Garrett Cole got to free agency, he was coming off a year in which he finished second in the Cy Young, led the league in ERA with a 2.50 ERA, was in the World Series with the Houston Astros, and won 20 games, the only time in his career he did that. His trajectory over the 2 years heading to free agency was even better than Corbin Burns. Now, look, Corbin Burns' last 2 years have not been bad, but Corbin Burns' best season was 2021. This past season with the Orioles was 2.92 ERA, 32 starts, 194 innings. We'll see where he finishes in the Cy Young vote. Very good year. Not as good as Garrett Cole going into free agency. The year before that, his last year with the Brewers, he finished 8th in the Cy Young voting with a 3.39 ERA, the highest ERA of his career in a full season. So if you look at the 2 years that Cole had entering free agency versus the 2 years that Burns entered free agency, the trajectory for Cole was better than the trajectory for Corbin Burns. So I would not give Corbin Burns what Garrett Cole wanted. I wouldn't. I think he's close. I think he's similar. I think he's a shade below. Years-wise, here's the complicated part. I don't want to give anybody 9 years. I don't. When the Yankees gave Garrett Cole 9 years, it was almost like kind of what we talked about with Soto and the Mets. We can't lose him. So we're going to give him whatever the hell he wants. I would not want to give Corbin Burns 9 years. I wouldn't want to give him 7 years. What I would want to do if I'm the New York Mets, and money is no object, because does this relate to Juan Soto? To me, it shouldn't. You're talking about a different aspect of your team. I would try to rise up the money per year and try to get Corbin Burns on a shorter term contract. That's what I would try to do. Will Scott Boras go for that? Like, if I offer him $40 million a year, which is greater than Garrett Cole, a little bit less than what Max Scherzer and Verlander were getting, and I give him a 5-year contract, so I'm giving him $200 million, is that something Scott Boras would go for? I'm more open to that. Because to me, when I'm looking at these contracts, it's the years when it comes to starting pitchers. What the Mets did really well this past year is they got guys on short-term deals. I know that to sign Corbin Burns, you're not going to get him on a short-term deal. You're not getting him on a 2-year contract. But how many years are you willing to go, especially for a guy who is coming off a very good year, but his strikeout rate is down? Let me go through that real quick. Go all the way back to 2020, 13.3 Ks per nine. His Cy Young year, 12.6. Year after that, 10.8. Last year, 9.3. This past year, 8.4. That is a clear decline. Now, with that said, Corbin Burnes also is finding a new way to pitch. Just because you're striking out less guys and you're pitching more to contact may not necessarily be the worst thing in the world, especially if you're more efficient and you're still getting guys out. But it is a warning sign that maybe the stuff isn't the same. The spin rate has altered over the last couple of years. His velocity is down a tick. This doesn't mean he can't be successful over the next 4 or 5 years and can't find a new way to be successful over the next 4 or 5 years. But it's worth talking about, and it's worth worrying about, and it's worth bringing up. And it's why I would not go, excuse me, to the Garrett Cole territory. I just wouldn't. I also think this. I am willing to kind of have that one gamble on a starting pitcher on a long-term contract that has a chance to not work out versus multiple guys. So if you sign Corbin Burnes to a 5 or 6 year deal, to me, that also means I'm building out the rest of my rotation on short-term contracts. And I'm hoping that I hit the same way I hit the last couple of years. Like, I think if you're the Mets and you're any team, even if you have no budget like Steve Cohen, though I'm sure there is a budget, I only want one starting pitcher that I'm going balls to the walls to on a long-term contract. Now, I mentioned Garrett Cole, 9 years, $324. Let's look at some others. Let's look at some comparables. Carlos Rodon, who did not nearly, not even close, have the same resume as Corbin Burnes, got 162. I'll tell you why that's very, very concerning. It's not the money per year, because that's $27 million a year, which I'm not losing sleep over. It's the fact that when Rodon got to free agency, he literally had one full elite season. One, maybe 1.5. If you want to include 2021. In fact, you know what? I'm a good guy. I'll include both of those years because he made 24 starts. All right, that's close enough to saying it's a full year. He barely pitched in 20. He barely pitched in 19. He missed a lot of time in 18 and wasn't great. Like Carlos Rodon's trajectory before getting 162, going into his age 30 season, so very similar to Corbin Burnes, was with far less track record. I don't mind the 27 per. I would love to not have to give Corbin Burnes 6 years. If I'm giving him a long-term contract, that's probably my cutoff, though. So would you go 6 years, $222? That matches Garrett Cole's salary at $37 a year. You're giving him 3 fewer years on the contract. You're giving him the same amount of years as Carlos Rodon, but you're giving him that financial, hey, you're matching Garrett Cole. That, to me, that's as far as I'm going, honestly. And maybe that last year, that 6th year, has some kind of vesting option where he's got to be healthy in his 5th year for that option to vest. But this is it. Like, if you sign Corbin Burnes to a contract like this, I don't want to go deep diving for other starting pitchers on long-term deals over the next few years. This needs to be the one. I don't like the idea of building a rotation around multiple guys on big-time long contracts. The other comparable I want to throw at you, we gave you Rodon 162 or 162. The other guy's Aaron Nola. So Aaron Nola, again, same age thing. He was turning 30 going into free agency, or actually 31 going into free agency. Aaron Nola had, I think, this going for him. He was Mr. Reliable, which I think Burnes sort of has too. Like Corbin Burnes makes every start. Aaron Nola, take out 2020 because it was such a weird year that we made every start. 33 starts in 18, 34 starts in 19, 32 in 21, 32 in 22, 32 in 23. Re-signs, makes 33 all this year. So very reliable, but Aaron Nola, to me, other than 2018, which was a long time ago, never had the dominant seasons that Corbin Burnes has had. In fact, Aaron Nola, to me, is not an ace. He's a very good innings eater. And by the way, in Philadelphia, he doesn't need to be an ace, so it works out well for them. Aaron Nola got 172, which is actually less than what Rodon got. He got one more. Explain that one to me, by the way. How the hell does Aaron Nola, with all that reliability we laid out, get less money per year than Carlos Rodon? That's the Yankees and other teams betting that the best is yet to come, which is a part of this. And I admit that. And that's what makes the Burnes thing tricky, because the Ks are down, because the spin rate's down a little bit. Like, are we going to see more decline from Corbin Burnes? And if that's the case, then 6 years, $222 is a tough contract to hand out. But I think that's my limit. I also want to admit this. While we'll sit here today and talk about the furthest we'd go on contracts to these guys, if they sign Corbin Burnes to more than I want to offer, at first we'll say, hate the contract. What are you doing? And then you'll be excited that Corbin Burnes is a New York Met. Let me read some of the contract offers. Big Pimpin' writes, Corbin Burnes, 0 years, $0 million. I'm not interested in big money pitching on the wrong side of 25 years old. It's New York City over everybody else tweets, 5 years, $140 million. I don't think that's getting it done, by the way. I like that. I just don't think that's getting it done. I don't think that's pulling it off. Nick DeLuca, pass on Corbin Burnes. Ben Yole, short-term high AAV for Corbin Burnes, 0 interest in a long-term deal. I get it. I get why there's concern about giving him a long-term deal. My bet is that this is the one guy I do it for. I don't love giving long-term deals to starting pitchers, but I think you can do it with one guy. I'm not doing it with Luis Severino. I'd love if he came back on the qualifying offer, and good job by the Mets offering that to both him and Sean Manaea, because to me, it's a win-win. You lose each guy, you get a pick, great. You bring them back or they accept the qualifying offer, which I doubt they will. Manaea won't, but I guess Severino could. Great. I'll take anybody on a one-year deal. But I'm okay with the one guy getting the long-term deal. So I'll disagree with some of my Met brethren. I'm not loving 6. That's as far as I'd go if there's a vesting option. If you go a little bit shorter, I'd raise the AAV, try to match Garrett Cole. So I'd like Corbin Burnes, but unlike Juan Soto, there is a limit. With Juan Soto, there is no limit. Your thoughts, by the way. You can continue to file them in on how far you'd go with Juan Soto, how far you'd go with Corbin Burnes. And for those that are not interested in Corbin Burnes, who do you want? Is it exclusively short-term deals? Are you more intrigued in Max Fried and Blake Snell than I've been? Now, don't worry about Blake Snell and Max Fried. We will have a Rico coming up shortly where we do a deep dive on all the starting pitchers. So we'll get into all the other options. That's why I am curious about your thoughts, which you can email us, thericob@gmail.com. Same thing with Juan Soto. Seems to be pretty consensus. We all want him, and we're all willing to go as far as it takes to get him. Deep dive on starting pitching coming up. We'll examine everything David Stearns had to say at the GM meetings. We'll get into some of the smaller on the margins moves the Mets have already made to start the offseason. So we got a lot to do over the next few days and next few weeks here on Rico Brogna. You can email us anytime, thericob@gmail.com, thericob@gmail.com. Thank you very much for listening, subscribing, and downloading another edition of Rico Brogna.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Rico Brogna podcast. It's amazing, isn't it? Make sure you download it now to keep it on you at all times.